Greetings, dear listeners. Today we will delve deeper into Christian monasticism and the lives of the founders of Christian contemplative orders. To do so, I'm joined by Addison Hodges Hart. Addison, I'm very glad you could join me for this conversation.
I'm glad to be here.
Great. But before we delve in, perhaps could you give a bit of a personal background about yourself for those listeners who wouldn't be acquainted with your work? And while you're at it, perhaps also give a bit of an explanation about the book that brought us together today. Because through your efforts, a new edition of Walter Nigg's old book, Warriors of God, the Great Religious Orders and Their Founders, through your efforts, that book has been republished by Angelico Press. I believe the original was published in 1959, if I'm not mistaken. And so I wouldn't have known about it unless you did all those efforts and got it republished. And now I've read it and I'm very happy I could do so. So first, tell a bit more about who you are and then perhaps explain how your personal background connects to your desire to republish such a decades-old book.
Well, just about myself, just to give you an idea of where I come from, I was for a long, long time an Anglo-Catholic or Anglican of the very high church persuasion, and was even a priest in the Anglican Church, Episcopal Church, for quite some time in the United States. Went for a few years, I switched out, became a Roman Catholic, eventually came back to Anglicanism, and today I'm an Orthodox Christian, and very happily so, because I think all the roads for me were leading in the direction of Eastern Orthodoxy. And it's a road I've been on for about 40 or more years, more than 40 years actually, closer to 45. So that's where I am now. The book that I helped to get published, Walter Nigg's Warriors of God, was something that many years ago, when I was still in my 20s, I was very close to a monastery. It was a convent of Anglo-Catholic sisters. They're still going today. They are now Roman Catholic, but at the time they were Anglo-Catholic. Anglican. And at the same time, I was studying, actually under a Greek Orthodox professor. I was studying the history of Christianity, and I was discovering the Philokalia, a collection of Eastern Christian monastic writings, and I was very much involved with the life at this convent. I was making retreats there. I knew many of the sisters, and I didn't have a spiritual father. I had a spiritual mother. She was my guide there. And while I was there, I discovered this book, and it was for me, a seminal work. It seeded my imagination and thoughts, and I really, for a while, contemplated becoming a monk myself. I had pursued that with a friend of mine, actually, who was also interested, and we were looking at various monasteries and things like that. And that never happened. Ended up getting married and had children, and all that. Mm. And now I live in Norway. But this book had a huge influence on me in many respects. Through it, I gained my first familiarity with many of the figures that are depicted in it, because it's a series of biographies as well as the kind of spirituality and the kind of orders that they established. And it's also a quite scholarly work at the same time that it's a popular writing and easily engaged for any intelligent reader. It's also the work of someone who was known to be a very fine historian, and not just a historian, but someone who can actually offer a critique and almost a philosophical insight for each one, and show you both the strengths and the weaknesses in each of the orders, which is then complemented or supplemented by orders later on that develop in the church. So that's basically it. And then this book, I realized a couple of years ago, I guess, that I hadn't read it in a long, long time. 40 years had gone by, and I had not picked it up, and I didn't have a copy. And I searched online and discovered that the only way to get a copy was to find the one English edition. The book had been written in 1955 in German and then translated into English in 1959. Apparently, it was a well-received book at the time, but as far as I know, just the one English edition and then never republished by anybody. So I contacted John Reese at Angelico, who's published books I've written. And I thought it might take me a while before I found a publisher, actually. But John just immediately said, yeah, this should be back in print. And it is. So that's the story.
Great. Let's start perhaps with the title of the book, which is Warriors of God. And you actually write about it in your preface to the book in the foreword. It's a title that today, for many people, might sound a bit strange because any hint of linking militarism with religion, that's a no-go, let's say. But you give an apologia, as you call it. You defend the title. And so please go ahead, elaborate more on it, why you think it's actually still appropriate to use the title Warriors of God.
Well, I think it's appropriate because, for example, to give you one example of an Eastern Orthodox text, which is actually an Eastern Orthodox reworking of a Western text, and that's the book Unseen Warfare. Very important book, originally written, I think, in the 1600s, perhaps, by Lorenzo Scopoli, and then reworked twice by Nicodemus at the Holy Mountain and Theophan the Recluse, okay, and orthodoxized, if you will. And I like the title of the book. The original book was Spiritual Combat by Scopoli, the Orthodox version, Unseen Warfare. And I think that's the key right there, is what you hear in that title. It's unseen warfare. That's certainly that militaristic, if you want to use that term, in the sense of something that involves war, struggle, internal conflict. Going right back to St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So right there, you are being told that we're not fighting literally. This is something, we are fighting literally, but it's a spiritual fight. It's a warfare that doesn't involve shedding human blood or acts of cruelty or anything of that nature. It's a war where, in a sense, we experience ourselves as being under attack by something of a spiritual nature, and we learn how to resist those influences. I think you can boil it down to the words, according to Sulpicius Severus, writing in the 4th century about the life of St. Martin of Tours, who had been a soldier. His very name reflects his Martin, reflects his martial life, had an experience, converted to Christianity, and when he was asked about how that affected his being a soldier, he said, "I'm a soldier of Christ, therefore I cannot fight," which is a wonderful statement, So he's a man of peace, but inwardly, he knows himself to be in conflict. And if we say, what is it that we're in conflict with? Well, we find the answer in 1 John chapter 2, where he says, the things like the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, these things which would take hold of us come from the world, not from the Father. And that's where the struggle begins. And then, of course, we have the imagery in Paul. It's repeated in the Epistle of James. It's all throughout that flesh and spirit are in a struggle. And by flesh, we don't mean just the body. We mean aspects, the passions, if you will, those things which create problems for us. And then there's the whole spiritual realm, which the fathers, and we read about this. Nigg has a very good section where he discusses St. Anthony and the struggle with the demons. The demonic being that which intentionally affects our thinking. So it's constantly a mental fight where we are our nous, the mind, our phronema, our whole mental equipment needs to be readjusted in light of Christ, and that gets to the very heart of what Nigg means when he uses that title, Warriors of God. He's not talking about a literal flesh and blood fight, but a literal spiritual fight that all Christians are called to, actually.
It makes me think of I was quite surprised when I was reading a bunch of apophthegma, and I was going through all the list of sayings of Poyman. And it's about, in that particular anthology, it was about 50 pages or something. Mm-hmm. And it takes about until page 25 of all those sayings before he starts talking about Christ and God and Bible and so on. And the first 25 pages are all about this, the way you perform the mental struggle, the way you go the spiritual fight against the flesh and the passions and the world, as you explain. It's interesting how in the writings of the Desert Fathers, this was so on the forefront of what they were talking about.
Yeah. Is it Abba Omonis? I think it could be Abba Omonis. Anyway, it's one of the very early Desert Fathers, who basically said, I went to the desert to escape the world, and then I found that I carried the world with me. So, that's the reality. You're not going to escape the world simply by physically removing yourself from it. It's something you carry along with you, and that's where, and then again, that's where the struggle takes place.
Which is definitely an experience in my own life as well, living in an old hermitage in a forest and so on, thinking that here it's gonna go easy, and then you notice, oh well, all that stuff that kept me back over there, that didn't really go away. It's still inside, yeah.
Still there.
Definitely, yeah. Okay, but coming from the title Warriors of God, there's this hypothesis I want to share with you and then see how you react to it. So give me a bit of time to elaborate on my question and what I exactly mean. So I have a feeling kind of that lots of the founders of the monastic orders try to, in a certain sense, explicitly invert militaristic logic. It's not like they talk about nonviolence, and certainly not in a way that somebody like Gandhi or Martin Luther King would, but there's something there that is often linked to militarism and to violence and how they choose monastic life in a sort of contrast with the logic of the world's militaristic way of being. And I guess you can give a bunch of examples. One of the examples that's often given is Pachomius when he founded the first, let's say, Cenobitic life. He does so because he had a background as a militaristic person, and the way he structures his monasteries is in the way that the barracks of the military of his day would be organized as well. Another example, Basil himself, who uses the term, my monks are soldiers in the service of God, but at the same time, Nigg also mentions that Basil is the one who brings in or helpfully starts emphasizing the idea of hesychasm, of inner tranquility and searching for the inner peace and so on. So soldier of God in the sense that we've just explained, to arrive at this inner peace. And so this inner peace in contrast with the outer peace, also knowing how great the emphasis was of the Desert Fathers on fighting the various passions, but anger often being singled out as the most egregious one and the one that you have to fight against most. So anger, violence, the link is there as well for me. And then certainly somebody like St. Francis, which I know best of all the founders just for some personal reasons, but St. Francis himself as well, he wanted to become a soldier, a real soldier in the army and so on, and then he becomes a captive. He's a military captive, and when he's in prison, he realizes a bunch of stuff, and it gets him on this other path, and that path leads him quite far in the sense that, for example, he does meet the Sultan. So in contrast with the crusaders of his time, he does eventually get to the Sultan. He has this dialogue, and he's allowed to travel to Jerusalem and so on and so on. And so Francis, as this historic example of how nonviolence is a completely different approach to life and probably leads you more to the kingdom of God than the military logic of the world. And there's also a story that could be told about Ignatius, who also wanted to become a soldier and didn't in the end. So bunches of examples of this tension, at least, and in my eyes contrast, where there's some sort of inversion of the military logic, at least in the lives of the founders. I'm not saying that necessarily after them it would always be lived in that way. And I personally have the feeling that Nigg, he's a bit double on that level. On the one hand, I sometimes think he ignores the link, and at the other hand, I think it's essential to his writing. So, for example, in page 60, I just looked it up, Pachomius, he mentions, he has a strong emphasis on religious obedience within his monasteries. And then he writes, but this has no analogy with military obedience. While I would think, well, that's exactly the point. I think that's where he got it from. And then on the other hand, just to make the contrast, it's a beautiful passage, so I'd like to read it. It's in the introduction. And so he sets the stage for the rest of his book. And then there's a passage like this. If we look squarely at the 20th century, which refuses to learn from the experience of 2 world wars, we can hardly do otherwise than call it the century of destruction. Hurtling from one catastrophe into another, our world seems unable to find a way out of this vortex of death. The hideous symbol of this century is the man armed with a machine gun stomping off over endless heaps of ruins. And every Christian who really takes his faith seriously is weighed down by the questions: what solution is there to this demonic apocalypse? Who is capable of offering effective challenge to the beast from the abyss? Who has the inner strength to meet the robot of our times and defeat him in spiritual combat? These are tremendous questions that will run like a basic theme through Christian history in the coming decades. So on the one hand, yes, he writes in the 50s, which is just after World War II. And on the other hand, who has the inner strength to meet the robot of our times and defeat him in spiritual combat? That sounds as present as ever. So here's a bit of Nigg and my whole introduction about my hypothesis. Is half of what lots of the monastic founders are doing a sort of inversion of the militaristic logic? Is it an effort to find non-violence within, counter to the violence of the world without? Or am I going too far?
Yeah, I think certainly that's something that you see over and over again, as you point out, and certainly Nigg. I mean, you know, how many ex-military men are founders? Well, you can count them up. There's a lot of them there who start out, at least like Francis, wanting to go in that direction. But yeah, that's precisely right. Like you, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I don't see why it would be said that the kind of obedience that Pachomius instills in his monks in the monasteries that he sets up, which, by the way, were double monasteries. There were also women monastics as well as men monastics. I just mentioned that because that was actually something that was present right almost from the outset. And I think it's quite obvious that he modeled those forms of obedience on military life. So, in other words, the structure was not something necessarily, and again, even Benedict and Basil, both of them, when we use the word order in the Latin West, it becomes orders, okay? Different orders. But when we just use that word order, which in the Latin is regula, of course, it's very definitely, this is in some way a regimented lifestyle. You were meant to come in, you were meant to listen. I mean, the very first word of Benedict's rule is listen. which means listen in the sense of be obedient. So this idea of obedience is right there, right from the outset, and of course obedience can be and has been very many times abused, but obedience is what establishes an order. It means that if you're here to learn, then you're not here to bring in your ideas. You're here to conform to the tradition that we have established to shape you, which will help you, just like in a military camp, to be equipped. And we know this from our experience. We know this from our not just mental tradition, but from the actual experience of elders who've lived this life. We know how to equip you so that you actually know how to enter into, say, a spiritual life that will involve a lot of interior rearrangement in your own life, because you're going to go deep and you're going to have to begin the process of a transfiguration inwardly with God. And so when you use that word order, what you're saying is you're entering into something that will be in some ways regimented. You will be expected to eat the food we eat here. You will be expected to get up when it's time to get up. You're not to grumble. You will feel sometimes like grumbling, but you're not allowed to do that. You will eat what's set before you. You'll go to the offices, to the prayer offices every day at a certain time. You will make your confession. You will be submitted to an elder who will go over your progress and your faults, even on a daily basis in some ways. And all of this is, in that sense, similar to what you go through in a military setting. Now, having said that, that's structural. What is it that you're actually doing? You're becoming a man who is so aligned with Christ and with who is our peace and all that when you go into the world and confront that, you do it as someone who brings light and life and energy and love and all the positive things and the healing, if you will, and the resurrection life that Christ that comes from Him. And the other thing, of course, is that historically, and this is true East and West, at least in the Benedictine centuries in the West, at the center of most communities in the Christian world, eventually monastic houses were at the center of those communities. You had your lay people and they're living their lives, but where the energy was being drawn from was usually a group of monks who were your most dedicated, usually right from the local area in which you live, the most dedicated men and or women that were in a sense the inspiration for the secular life outside its walls. So
there's also something in when you mention they were the most dedicated and so on, there's an aspect in the monastic life which is, because of its disciplined order, it succeeds in another ideal of monasticism in general, living in frugality, let's put it that way, or leading a life of poverty, and thus trying to follow Christ in the sense of you have to choose. It's either following the mammon, the god of money, or it's following the real God. And I think there's something to be said that this aspect of asceticism and living a life of poverty, of frugality, is in some ways perhaps the same thing as not following the logic of violence, because following the mammon, trying to get as rich as you can, trying to become, I don't know how successful, and showing off to the world how successful you are within the logic of the mammon, that eventually ends up suppressing the needs of others, elevating your own desires, and so on. So do you see a link there between the distancing of violence and the asceticism? Are they intricately connected?
Here's where the paradox in a way comes in. You cannot be a good monastic or a good Christian ascetic of any kind, and all Christians are called to asceticism. There is no such thing as a Christian who is not supposed to be ascetical. Okay, I mean, obviously, there's perfect chastity in which you have renounced marriage, and then there is chaste marriage, but chastity is still the ideal and still the goal. And chastity doesn't mean no sex. Chastity means something much more profound, including a certain loyalty to the person, and and all that. That having been said, no one can be an ascetic in the Christian sense and be someone who is given to any form of violence and hatred and is at the whim of their own anger and this sort of thing. That is one of the things that actually your ascetical, almost interiorly militaristic training is meant to undermine and to purge out of your system. The desire to be destructive, to be vengeful, to be someone who hates, someone who is constantly angry about this, that, or the other thing. So, yeah, to answer your question, the answer is yes. But it's interesting that the very language gets inverted, as you say. The language of being a warrior means that you can't go into the world and practice physical warfare. And that's a beautiful image. And at the same time, it's not meant to be, as Paul himself from the very beginning clearly says, it's not flesh and blood that we're out there fighting.
I'll bring in a second hypothesis. It's something that I really wanted to discuss with someone who knows as much as you about the whole history of monasticism. And that's that I have the feeling, because of being warriors of the flesh then, and living a frugal life and succeeding in it, going the mile, let's say, and succeeding in it, that means that you end up with communities of people who don't need too much because they suffice with the bare minimum. But they're also focused on sharing with others and giving to those who are in need. And so living the real Christian life, exactly like you say, there is no real Christian in the sense of followers of Christ who are not in some way ascetic. And so they're actually living that ideal and they're succeeding in it. But at the same time, monasticism, for me, is this whole history of almost like in the Old Testament, trying to reach the ideal and then falling down and then getting back up again and falling down again. Yeah. There's a constant repetition of restoring monastic life. Almost all of the founders Nigg mentions are, in a way, people who try to restore what they think used to be before them. But at the same time, I think there's something in the fact that it succeeded that somehow inherently had the seed of its corruption. That is to say, when you live a life which is frugal and which succeeds in creating people who live with whatever is enough for them and then are able to share with others of their surplus, then enters the surplus, and the elite and the economic elite and the political elite eventually sees a way of life in which people succeed in creating huge surpluses, and then they start co-opting it, and the moment they co-opt it, the original ideal falls. And so that's the hypothesis I wanted to put before you. Is it so that indeed monasticism, often the degradation of certain monastic orders comes in when the elite figures out, hey, that life actually works and it could be turned into my benefit as well?
We see it over and over again historically, obviously, where monasticism in many cases succeeds admirably and continues in the same place doing what it's always done. In St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, for example, which is one of the oldest foundations in the world and still going. Others where they've become almost obscenely wealthy, and those orders begin to experience two things: either a complete relaxation of of the ascetical life that begins to diminish. It becomes a very cushy, comfortable life. This is what Teresa of Avila discovered, if you remember in the chapter on her in Nigg's book, especially. The Carmelite convents became a place where the rich sent their daughters who they couldn't get married off, and they basically just sat around and gossiped, and they did what they were supposed to do, but it was the bare minimum, and it was sort of it was religious in the most bland sense, and she finally had enough of it and started the Discalced Carmelite order, which was much more rigorous. And you see this also, Bernard reacting against the Cluniacs and the very comfortable, rich Benedictine life, and joining what was already in existence, Robert of Molem and Alberic and Richard Harding. And he joins their order, which is the Cistercians, and they were a very back to the basics, rigorous monastic in the Benedictine world lifestyle. So you see this again and again. It happens over and over again with reforms, and then even reforms of the reforms. This is, and I think that's a sign of health, actually, a sign of life. Yes, many orders, many monastic orders become decadent and moribund and have to be revived, or let them die. But the dynamism continues in various ways. And so, yeah, I think that's a recurring cycle, and certainly Nigg addresses that in many of his chapters, as he goes along.
But would you see one specific element, which is the main element that drives this?
The main element, I hate to sound like I'm avoiding this, the physical aspect of it, but the central element is simply a loss of the ideal to follow Christ. It's, in other words, it begins with your spiritual intention. Is it to be conformed to Christ or not? Are you seeking this literally for the sake of theosis, of transformation, of becoming more and more divinized like Christ? Or, in which case, you will put every ounce of your heart, mind, soul, and spirit into this, as Jesus says, what is the first and great commandment? To love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's really the essence of all asceticism, and it's the essence, certainly, of monasticism. When you lose that, and when it becomes simply doing what needs to be done to get through the religious routine, and it just becomes a routine, and the goal, the purpose, the personal transformation aspect of it is no longer central, then of course other things are going to come in. You're not going to be able spiritually any longer to recognize when you have too much, or when you are accumulating, when you should be divesting yourself of all these excessive things, or to become more frugal, to live more chastely. I mean, the reason you have problems with chastity, for example, in some cases, is simply because they have lost all idea of why they're even there. And that happens over and over again. In the West, you had another problem that came in, and that was the utilization of the monasteries by the elite for it sounds strange to us, to our ears, but in the Middle Ages, it made perfectly good sense. We establish a monastic house, which then has an oratory, which then prays for my soul after I'm dead, so that I will, be sure to get through purgatory as quickly as I'd have to, in order, well, that once that comes in the Middle Ages, many of the problems in Western monasticism begin to develop, because now the monks are not there to deal with their own spiritual lives, their own transformation. They're basically there as functionaries to do a job for the people who basically built their monastery. So you get this problem, and they're being paid handsomely to do this. So you have that whole economic thing that comes into effect, which is steadily undermining the spiritual stamina of the monastic house itself. So
interesting. One of my questions was, what is the essence of monastic life? And in a sense, you've answered it by saying, well, it's the theosis, and that should be central. Or am I following Christ? And is that the life I'm trying to lead as radical as I can? But on the other hand, you could say, well, isn't theosis the essence of every form of Christian life and not specifically monasticism? So
yeah.
I'll rephrase the question. What then within Christianity makes, according to Walter Nigg, or you yourself, or perhaps you agree with Nigg on this matter, but what is the essence of monastic life? Because, of course, we're talking about various forms of life, and that's also what in the book is
Right.
so beautifully written, from the Desert Fathers to the Cenobitics to the people like St. Francis who become wandering monks again, and so on and so on. So there's a whole variety. So what actually unifies them into one specific thing?
I would say you almost have to split Nigg's book into two halves, and in some ways, that's how you'd have to split. First, we have to make a distinction. There's a distinction, a very clear distinction to be made between monasticism and religious life. Nigg is not always very clear on this, to be honest. And it could be his Protestant background that he's failing to see what is actually, at least in the Catholic world, a very major distinction. The contemplative monastic orders are a very distinctive and much more ancient form of the consecrated life than the religious orders. Now, there's some overlap. Okay, the Carmelites are an interesting case, for example. The Carmelites started out as basically a group of hermits in the Holy Land, ended up, for various reasons, mainly the Islamic invasions and the Crusades and whatnot, they end up in places like England and Spain and elsewhere. And because they were, in a sense, they were very much like the Carthusians. It was a group of hermits, basically. And it then becomes, with the influence of the friar movements, Dominicans, Franciscans, they become friars, which means they're much more active in the world. But in reality, the Carmelite order was still very contemplative. So it's a fascinating overlap between the contemplative and the active. Other orders, like the Jesuits, they have a specific mission which Antony the Great would not have recognized at all. He wouldn't have understood even what they're about, basically. And they become, in effect, they become an evangelistic order, an intellectual order, and one that's absolutely dedicated to doing whatever the Pope tells us. So and their spirituality is not monastic. That's the one thing where I think we have to be clear. When you start looking at the exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, you have departed radically away from the monastic style. I'm not going to get into all that, but it's vastly different, and it's somewhat at odds with, say, Basil, Benedict, the classical monastic order. So that's the two halves. And you have to say that, for example, where does Francis fall? Francis is a fascinating case in point because in many ways he's very much like a Basilian monk, in the mode of Basil the Great. You could even call him a fool for Christ's sake in that sort of Russian way. Very much a contemplative and very radically rooted in things like the Sermon on the Mount. That's for him. That's the only rule that exists is what Christ has to say. Everything else is superfluous. But in that, strangely, very much in accord with, say, someone like Antony the Great. Very very similar beginnings. Basically leave everything and go off and. Both the call of Antony and the call of Francis, that's, at that level, very similar. how they live it out's somewhat different, and because they're just different people, very different characters. But the two halves have to be seen to some extent separately. And so when you're reading Nigg, you're reading a series of biographies, and you're getting a wonderful introduction. However, the big question is, are we talking about monastic charism or religious life charism? And so to get back to your question, I would say probably the most important charism that we should seek to see restored is not so much the religious life. That will always be there because people will always be in the world, and they will always. But the question is, to what extent is the monastic life still relevant in today's world? And that is the life of contemplation, regular prayer, and all of that. And I'd say we have two models for that. Both of them very much related to the other, and that is in the East. In the East, there are no monastic orders. Okay, you have monks and you have laity, and there is no difference spiritually or ascetically between the two. A lot of people don't realize this. In Orthodoxy, you do not have that same kind of separation that you have in the West. All of the prayers that, I would say, as a lay person in the Orthodox Church, I was ordained, but in the Orthodox Church, I've decided to be humble and stay put, as a lay person. The prayers I would say each day are prayers that have been greatly influenced by the monastic tradition and orthodoxy. It just simply is. It's in the air you breathe. What the monk does, he just does more of it because he's actually dedicated to fostering the depth of spiritual life in the Orthodox Church. So Basil's vision that at the heart of that you have these very dedicated apostolic men who are the ones who end up being the bishops. Your parish priest is usually and intentionally married because they believe very much that when Paul says, for example, that let the bishop be the husband of one wife, basically to see how does he run his household, because when you look at how he runs his household, you'll know how he'd be able to run the church. So that's a different thing, but they're all still praying the same prayers. The divine liturgy, all of that reflects the influence of monasticism, right down to the very prayers that are prayed. Most of that's been written by monks and given to the church by monks. That's the East, and as you can see, that's a very interesting understanding of monasticism, but it's just commonplace throughout the Eastern world. In the West, what you had was roughly the same thing for a long, long time, right up to the time of Bernard. I'd say where it really begins to change is around the time of Bruno and Bernard. And the only reason it changes is because they want to get back to the original monastic charism. Okay, the world is changing. The West is becoming more scholastic, more rationalistic. And in fact, that's one of the problems I see with the Dominicans and with the Jesuits, is that they became much more rationalistic in their approach to the faith. I don't think there's anything strange in the fact that it's St. Bernard who gets referred to as the last of the fathers, because basically in the West he is. He's the last. I mean, his great argument with Abelard indicates this. He was very harsh on Abelard, but basically he's right, that Abelard represents something in the West that is unknown to the patristic inheritance of the Church. The East had the same problem, but they decided differently. The West went more with Abelard and left Bernard behind, and so he's the last of the fathers. In the East, there is no last of the fathers. But what you have at the center in the West is basically your Benedictine model. Even the Augustinians are still, in a sense, plugged into that. And And what is Benedict doing? Well, at the center of many of the Christian communities in the West, for the longest time, you had these Benedictine monasteries. And again, these were the people that you went to for your spiritual edification. Very often, they would share their goods with the community around them. When you went to confession, you very often would go to a monk. Even in the Middle Ages, you still could go to a lay brother and confess your sins. It was a little bit looser than what happened later on. So you have these models both in East and West. And if I was to say, what do we need to recover today? We probably need to recover. In the East, it's not a problem. In the West, it is a problem. We need to recover something of that sense that at the heart of the church is a spirituality which is closer to the Benedictine model than to what came along later. From, say, maybe this, from roughly the 15th century on and 14th century on. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I think it approaches some of the issues I'm trying to get at. That monasticism has a place, but in the West it needs to be not simply to go to what exists already, but to say what was the original dynamism, and once again, how do we recover that, if you will?
Yeah, it's very interesting actually to make that distinction. And you mentioned that Nigg, it's probably his Protestant heritage, where in Protestantism they really got rid of that monastic side. And if you look at it, they never got rid of what you call the religious life. There's plenty of missionary groups and so on, which are very organized and go out into the world in a religious sense. But it's that specific contemplative aspect that got lost.
The key to the West is this. When the Benedictines make a vow, okay, they don't just simply make a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Okay, with the Franciscans and all, it's a point that actually was made recently in a book by called Mysticism, Magic, and Monasticism by Sebastian Morello. And I think he's right on that. I don't always agree with Morello, but I do agree on this point, that the key to the Benedictine life was the vow of stability, stabilitas, where you stay in one place. Okay, that if you remember in the Rule of Benedict, he's very critical of the gyrovags and the others who are wandering around. He wants his monks to, you stay put. Why does he want that? Because it's in stability that those people around you, they need to see. You're stable, you're put, you'll be there for years and years and years, and these people relate to you as a stable presence, not as a rotating priest. The Franciscan priest can come and preach for a few years, and again, he's off, he's gone, he's somewhere else. Dominicans, the same. Jesuits, they're basically holed up in universities anyway, so who cares? But the Benedictine community in the monastic era was a stable presence, and you knew it may be completely corrupt after a while and needs reform, but it was that stability that they exhibited that built up a healthy, and the Middle Ages, despite all the stupid TV dramas and all, which have absolutely no historical awareness whatsoever from what I can see, was a very deeply religious culture. It wasn't always perfect, but it was. And what was at the center of it, very much as in the Eastern Orthodoxy to this day, it's the monastic presence. And that was true. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's...
No.
But I thought that I better say it, yeah.
Yeah, and it links to what I wanted to get to next, which is the vows of stability and of poverty and celibacy and so on. Because when we think about contemplative life should be renewed, certainly in the West, certainly in a Protestant context and also in a Catholic context. But if we talk about the renewal of monastic life, I wonder what it might look like. Will it be exactly the same as what was, but in modern times, as has often happened, or will we see new forms? And I'll also relate this question a bit to once we take a broader interreligious view of monasticism and contemplative life, we see many forms all over the world, but even in Buddhist monasteries, for example, it's much more normal to enter for a couple of years and get out again. In ashrams, there is no vow of stability and so on and so on. It's centered around the guru more than anything else. And when you look at the guru or the sheikhs in Islamic tekkes and so on, they're often married. There's no vow of celibacy and so on. So there's something specific about the monasticism and the contemplative life within Christianity, which makes it really centered around a particular class of people or a particular type of people. And I'm wondering whether that will still hold up in the future. So what do you think? Are we going to see new forms of monasticism which perhaps are local but a bit more flexible in entering and getting out? Or are we going to see more oblates, people who are connected to a monastery but not necessarily themselves monastics? Or do you think it's going to go another way?
I think it can go both ways and side by side. I don't see it being an either or situation. I don't think you can create an entirely new monasticism. I think certainly not in the East. It would almost be impossible and undesirable. I don't think you need it, for one thing. What you will see, and what we are seeing today, I don't want to exaggerate it, but we are seeing a turn towards, say, traditional expressions of Christianity in a much bigger way, and we are seeing the formation of new monasteries. We have seen that in the past few decades. What's interesting is that the vast majority of them tend to be traditional, and by that I don't mean just traditionalist. Okay, we have to make that Yaroslav Pelikan distinction that traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, and tradition is the living faith of the dead. You're not going to escape tradition, nor should you. Tradition is the life of the Spirit in the church. Does that mean that every form of monastic life needs to, wear robes and pray in Latin or whatever it is? And that, of course, that's not at the heart of it. What is at the heart of it is to return to these the things we've been talking about. This understanding that there is a regula to be followed. There is an ascetical life to be followed. That one needs to have their goals and methods and ways of getting there defined. And for that, we have tons and tons of material to work with. Yes, you have to adapt in every age what has gone before. But certainly, say a collection, again, like the Philokalia is a good example of that, of the monastic or the conferences of John Cashin or whatever it is. These monastic resources are still available and are easily adaptable. Benedict's rule is very adaptable to any context. So do we need to reinvent the wheel? The answer to that is no. Will it look different in the future than it has in the past? Well, it looked different in the 11th century than it did in the 4th. So that's a matter of adaptation. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. But I think I'm also specifically wondering about the vows, I think. The vows of a lifelong vows. And that seems somewhat specific to Christian traditions. Well, it's not specific. You can find it in some other places as well, but it's dominant within Christian monasticism.
Yeah. Well, yes and no. There are many Benedictine houses. You might take a stretch of 3-year vows at a time, and eventually, when you're ready, you make a lifetime vow. So that I would say that nobody is compelled that you really, really must make a lifetime vow in the way that perhaps they used to be. Now, it's expected that you will, and maybe past a certain point, if you've been, kind of lingering around the monastery for 45 years and never made it. I'm exaggerating. It'd be a lot less than that, actually. But no, they want you to make a decision. And again, it's not that everybody's called who's called in the direction of say a monastic life, that they have absolutely, they will go with the blessing and the good wishes of everybody, but there are those for whom they cannot conceive of a different life than to remain and be there for the remainder of their lives. And so it's very much when they use the word vocation in the West. It's what one perceives to be their vocation, their calling. Literally, the word vocation means to be called. And there are many people who feel very definitely called to this as a lifetime thing. But if you're not, blessings on you, and take with you what you learned here into the world and the lifestyle that you lead outside the walls of the monastery, and you're always welcome back to renew yourself here and retreat. So I think that's healthy, but I would hate to see the lifetime vows ever be. Now, if there was, say, a new order that came up that said we just don't do that. That we have, we live according to everything else, but we don't do lifetime vows. And if the church in the West wanted to take that on, then that's fine. Like I say, in the East, it's less of a problem, simply because everybody sort of knows that if they're not literal monks, they're still spiritually monastic in some sense, because they're already participating in that whole heritage. It's a much more integrated mentality in the Eastern Orthodox world.
In that respect, I do wonder, how do you deal with a certain tension? That's certainly something in my personal life, where you've got those founders and they live a certain ideal. And on the one hand, you say everybody has his or her vocation. So you try to figure it out and you get inspired and you try to live it out in your own life, whatever the context of that life is. But on the other hand, when you read books, also like Nigg's book, you get those ideals of those people who have a quite radical life. Most of them, certainly in terms of poverty and celibacy and so on. And that's not something we can all do. So there always remains this tension. You'd like to be like them, but they also always look like people who have a different lifestyle, and that lifestyle seems like the only one capable of getting you as far as you'd like to go yourself. So how do you deal with that tension between the ideal and living normal life as a lay person?
Yeah. In some ways, I think it's a matter of maturity. I think as you get older, you realize when you're young and very zealous and on fire, it's never enough. You always feel that I'm falling way short, and patience with oneself is hard to come by. Or, unfortunately, that sometimes also goes along with a certain amount of arrogance. I have arrived. I've been a Christian for 3 years, and now I'm going to lecture you on how to be a good Christian like me. You get this, and it's even worse when they become converts to Orthodoxy or Catholicism or whatever. They're now going to save the world with what they've discovered. When you get older, as you probably know, you begin to realize that everything is Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, basically. The Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. That you're always going to be less than you want to be, and always striving. And let's face it, if you're a Christian, you're always striving for the very highest ideal. You're striving to be like Christ. Well, the promise is you will be, but you may not get there as quickly as you would like. That's the whole point of asceticism. And you're always going to find that you have more things inside of you that you are lurking in the corners of your soul that you didn't really know was there until the light got shined on it. It was back there in the back of the cave, completely unnoticed by you in the shadows. And then you had the torch of the Spirit, if you will, and you shine it, and oh my goodness, what is that horrible thing that's been, I know I smelled something back there, but that becomes the norm of the ascetical life. And that's really what the ascetical life is meant to do. And contemplative life, everybody thinks contemplation is simply to, I appreciate, say, for example, and I practiced for sometimes Zen practice, and I appreciate all of those things. but as methods only. At some point, you have to realize a contemplative life is not simply to achieve a state of mental bliss. It's actually to transform you within. And sometimes that's a painful experience. In fact, very often it is. In the Christian life, we go to confession. Okay, why do we go to confession? Because we keep finding stuff that we need to confess. All right, that's good for us because we're bringing it out into the light, like Jesus said in John 3. You're bringing it into the light, and when it's in the light, it can be healed. It can be dealt with. So, so how do I deal with that? You learn to become more and more patient, and the key is humility. It is in being humble, recognizing that I'm not, I haven't arrived. I'm not a saint. I'm in need of constant mercy. So that forces me to stay in prayer. That forces me to continue in the spiritual warfare, if you will, and also to love others who are in the same struggle. You see, so you become more and more patient, God willing, with others. Because they're also wrestling with the world and the flesh, the devil, and all that.
Now, what you say makes me think of two quotes. Let's say one is Mahatma Gandhi. One said, "God to be God must rule the heart and transform it." I think you're quite right. Most people, when they get into contemplative practices, whether it's Zen or some others, they try to arrive at this blissful state of mind, but that's not the point. The whole point is about getting transformed. And so the other thing I was thinking about is the title of that famous book, which is a contemplative book as well. The practice of the presence of God. And somebody like B.D. Griffiths would often, when he defines contemplative life itself, that's what he uses, that terminology, the practice of the presence of God.
Right.
And so it's a practice of a constant feeling of the presence of God, but it is a practice, and that's what you mean with the asceticism. And so, considering it's a practice, I'm really wondering, how do you implement some of the contemplative practices in your life? How do you make that concrete?
Well, the first thing is to have a personal regula. So I have said the daily offices for years and years, whether it was the Book of Common Prayer or when I was an Anglican or something like that. But in other words, learning through the Psalms and the prayers of the church and the readings of Scripture and the Fathers to transform your mind to think in the context of, if you will, the tradition. So the first thing would be to have a rule and to do daily offices as you can. I think every Christian should be praying the Psalms and doing it spiritually. In other words, we try to understand it not in the literal Old Testament sense, but when, for example, we hit a violent passage, we then relate that to, again, spiritual warfare. It becomes, and Benedict actually mentions this twice in the rule. So offices. Secondly, obviously a time of contemplative stillness, and that varies in length depending on the person. If you can do 20 minutes in the morning and that's it, then it's 20 minutes in the morning. If you do it 20 minutes twice a day, if you do it longer, an hour, but to do your offices and also practice the silent personal prayer life, and connected to that, praying for other people, praying for the needs of the world, praying for the dead, if your tradition allows for that. Mine does, obviously. So, and asking the prayers of those who have departed, so that you keep a link alive between you and those who you no longer see in this life. And then, of course, very important is to have a sacramental life, a liturgical life. I would say at the very, in Orthodoxy, it's vibrant, and the liturgical life is a constant drama, the divine liturgy. When you go into it, you are simply entering into something that is already, it's a given. It's not going to change for you. It's what it is. You come in and you participate in it. It is the tradition, and you conform to it. And with that, certainly the sacramental life, receiving the body and blood of Christ. So that's important. And then here's the thing about living a contemplative life. It's not this, I'm trying to achieve a state of mental bliss. I'm not trying to reach some kind of state or condition of being which is less and less connected to this world, and that somehow I dwell up here, and rather you begin to integrate your prayer life into your daily life, so that a good example is in the East, the Jesus prayer, because what you're trying to do is pray without ceasing, and so inwardly you are in constant prayer, and that's the integrated life. Now, you're not going to do that right off the bat. That takes years of practicing it and not doing it, remembering you should, and then you go back to praying. But to have an inward, integrated connection, if you will, with Christ, which is constant, so that if, for example, you can't, something comes along and you can't say your offices, or you can't practice stillness, or you can't get to the liturgy or whatever, there is still a living core of spiritual connection that is at the deepest part of your consciousness. So if I was to say how would one live that, those are the goals, and those goals are going to be the same whether you're a monastic or whether you're not. The monastic, as I said before, he does everything the average Christian does. He just is able to do a little bit more, and to give his life more fully. And again, it's what he is called to do, and he's called to be someone who is able ultimately to exude something that he can then share with the rest of the church. So he or she, I should say. I had a spiritual mother, so I have to say he or she. I can't be exclusively male here.
No, certainly not. It's indeed true. This we shouldn't strive for the blissful state. That's not what we're after. But at the same time, you mentioned it made me think of a passage which is also in Walter Nigg's book, and it's a passage I really like, of one of the Desert Fathers. It's one of the stories about Joseph of Boniface, in Dutch, I don't know in English, but so one of the abbas. And there's a monk who comes to him and he says, well, I've done everything. I've been fasting, I've been praying a lot, I've done this, I've done that, I've done all the stuff I have to do. What else is left for me? And then Joseph puts up his hands, and his whole hands, all his fingers become flames, and he says, well, you could also become nothing but flame. Yeah, and so in a sense, it's not what we strive at, but it is one of the results that normally will be given as a result of transforming your heart completely.
Yeah, and that's it. It's a result of. It's not something we achieve. It's not something we do for ourselves. It's we put ourselves in a position where God can do it in us, and ultimately, that's when you talk about something like the Jesus prayer or whatever. It's ultimately we want it to be God, in a sense, praying within us as we pray to Him. It's a union. But unless you do these other things, it's not likely you're going to develop that state. That's something that comes as a result. And even if you do achieve bliss, let's say you reach this, so what? I mean, who the hell cares? I mean, you're going to come you're going to come back to earth, and you're going to be the same person you were before. So, we're not into seeking highs or having psychedelic experiences or any of this stuff. What we do when we pray is concentrate on the prayer.
Yeah, absolutely. Final question to get us back to Walter Nigg as well. Who of all the founders that he described the lives of, who's the one that is closest to your heart? Is there one particular person that jumps out of the book and that for some reason you think we should be thinking about this person more?
I would say that I would have to say there's more than one. Benedict. I took the name Benedict, by the way, when I became Orthodox and was chrismated. I took the name Benedict first as an homage, if you will, to my Western roots. But I would say of the ones that really have the most influence, it would have to be Antony, and then Basil, and then Benedict, and Bernard, and also to some extent Bruno. Those were the ones that really, and love all the rest. I mean, Pachomius is certainly, and the chapter on Pachomius is superb. But I'm not sure I would have lasted 3 weeks in one of his monasteries. Benedict would have been more patient with me, I think, and Basil, and so I'm very fond of them. And Antony, you just love just because he's Antony, So.
Then, if it's difficult to pick just one person, is there one story that is very dear to your heart? One story out of the lives of the many that you think resembles or that explains or tells about the essence of what it is to lead a contemplative life?
Whoa. Well, the one you mentioned is a very fine one about St. Joseph. I would say if there's one story that's always had a special resonance for me, and the Desert Fathers are wonderful to turn to. I always like the fact that when they're being faced with an apparition in their cell, I'm Gabriel the Archangel, or I am Jesus Christ, and then they just say, well, I'm too insignificant for him to appear to, and then of course it turns out to be the devil, and he vanishes like that because it's a challenge there, and they resist visions and all that stuff. That I appreciate. But if there's one story I like, it's not one that's in Nigg at all, but it's one that's very familiar, and that's the story about Abba Moses, the great black man, the Berber, who became a Desert Father, and that's the one where. And it depends on which telling it is, whether it's a basket with sand or a jug with water. But either way, a brother has been caught in some kind of sinful act or something, and he's going to be judged by the community. And they call Abba Moses to come and take part in this council to judge the brother. And he puts this, let's say it's the basket of sand. He puts this basket of sand on his back. There's a hole in the bottom, and it's leaking sand out behind him. And he says, I come with my sins running out behind me to judge my brother. And with that, they let the brother go because here you have this great old Abba who shows that it's, mercy is of the most importance. Like I say, that's not in Nigg, but it's one of my favorite stories. And if I was to say what good does the contemplative life do, if it doesn't do anything else, it teaches you to be patient and loving of others. And so that to me is a special story.
It's a beautiful story indeed. Well, Addison, that was a very interesting conversation for me. Thank you for coming on once again. I'll have to mention Walter Nigg's book again, Warriors of God, The Great Religious Orders and Their Founders, published by Angelico Press, so everybody can go and buy it from their web store or anywhere else, and I really recommend it.
And I don't get a cent for this, just even though I got it and published it and contributed forward. So you're not giving to me if you buy it, but get it.
Interesting, but get it. Yeah, well, nice example of monastic humility there. So, Addison, thank you very much. And
Thanks.
See you another time.
Okay, Jonas. Thank you. Bye-bye.